While this isn't a super topical podcast, it nevertheless exists within time, and on some occasions, including this one, events may overtake us. This recording took place in early March 2023. Josie's One Cool Thing is a particular novel by Rachel Pollack, and I'm sad to say that Pollack died aged 77 on the 7th of April 2023. Her partner Judith shared the following via a friend on Twitter. I am sad to tell you that our beloved Rachel Pollack passed so peacefully and beautifully today at about 12:45 p.m. after a touching ceremony called Hand to Heart. Several of us stood in a circle. I had my hand on her heart. I began the circle by saying how much I love her and what she means to me. Each took their turn after me, sharing their own feelings and appreciation of Rachel. I know that Rachel will continue to be a light in this world and in the next. She will continue to inspire so many of our beloved tarot community, the science fiction and fantasy community, the comics community, and the transgender community for whom she shared so much respect and care. We are one. If anything, I think the conversation Josie and I have in this episode of One Cool Thing is testament to a lot of that. We would like to offer our respect and solidarity to Rachel Pollack's loved ones. Thank you.
A part of a version of the story of the place inside, first found by Leith Unquenchable fire in beauty and truth, lives her name forever.
Hello and welcome to One Cool Thing, a podcast from indie game studio Die Gute Fabrik, hosted by me, Hannah Nicklin. One Cool Thing is a podcast speaking with people in and around video games about one cool thing not from games, which is really fascinating them right now. I'm going to introduce them, their practice, talk about the one cool thing they've brought to the conversation, and together we'll all consider how it's shaping how they think about their work, and also get a chance to hear more about the practices of cool folks working in games, allowing us to all reflect on how we think about how we make things. So, without further ado, let's meet our guest. I'm delighted to welcome Josie Giles to the podcast. Josie is someone whom I feel like I've traced a career and practice alongside all these years. We've come from a similar-ish background of performance, but with a lot of differences in the mix too, which has always made it a delight when our paths cross again. Josie is a writer and performer from Orkney who now lives in Leith in Edinburgh. You might have heard of her recently because her super cool verse novel, Deep Wheel Orcadia, won the 2022 Arthur C. Clarke Award for Science Fiction Book of the Year. We have a legit Arthur C. Clarke Award winner in the house, people. It's true. It's true. Other work includes several wonderful poetry collections, a touring show called Drone, which is a really stunning sort of multimedia spoken word performance which imagines a life as a military drone. She's also in a punk band called Fit to Work. And I personally think Josie's collaboration with Paolo Pedicini, Game for Protests, is one of the most successful games as politics interventions yet to exist. Josie is also a significant figure in the interactive fiction scene, and it's from there that I tempted Josie to join us as a member of our writer's room on our next unannounced game at Die Gute Fabrik. Phew. Okay, well, when you have a career that spans media and genre, it's always going to produce a pretty full-on biography. How do you feel about my attempt, Josie? Anything you want to add, amend, or expand on there?
No, I liked it. I've started to. Do you know, I come from a very small island, and when you come from a small island, you learn not to talk yourself up, and you learn to if somebody talks you up, you immediately have to make yourself a little bit smaller because, you know, you can't have tall trees on a small island. It doesn't work. They all blow down. And there's very good reasons for that. And if you do go about doing that, then folk just think you're bigsy is the word. However, of late, I have tried to practice not cringing when somebody reads my bio out and just being like, yeah, I did do all of that. That was kind of cool, wasn't it? All right, yeah, sure.
For those who maybe haven't heard of Orkney before, I wonder if you could situate us in the world.
Sure, you go to the top of Scotland and then you hop over the sea.
Just
That's
hop
all.
over the sea.
I mean, it's a bit of a rough bit of sea, so bring some seasickness tablets. The Pentland Firth is renowned, literally renowned in sagas for being an unpleasant piece of sea to cross. So Orkney is the group of islands off the north of Scotland and south of Shetland. We are the sort of Scandinavian bit of Scotland in that we were owned by a Scandinavian crown until like the 15th or 16th century or something like that, and it still has a lot of influence over the culture.
I've asked you to bring in a cool thing for us to have a little chat about today, something that has influenced or is influencing your practice. And I wonder if you could tell us what your cool thing is.
Well, I want to talk about Rachel Pollack's 1988 novel Unquenchable Fire, which I'm just going to say won the Arthur C. Clarke Award in 1989. And winning that one was the thing I was happiest about of all, was that I suddenly found myself in a lineage with this extraordinary book from Rachel Pollack, who's one of the writers who has most inspired and influenced me in the last decade or so. Hands covered in ash, the teller reaches into the sack of winds and lifts out a charred wooden mask with the eyes and mouth rimmed in silver. I am the one who has taken a face. My fingers are birds, my fingers are beasts. My fingers are rocks and the water which lies on the rocks. My fingers are children, the dead, the living, the never born. My fingers are sticks to beat away time. I am the one who has taken a face. I am the one who speaks. I speak in all the voices. I am the wife of the sun, the sister of the night. I speak from the beginning to the end. I leave nothing out. Unquenchable Fire is a novel about ritual and magic and belief and storytelling. There once was a boy, and his mother named him He Who Runs Away. He lived in a far country, a dry land open to the sun. This land lay beyond the sea of sorrows, where confused souls hang above the water. They are the souls of those who took a wrong turn, who did not pay attention when their guides were leading them to the land of the dead. It is set in a world in which ritual governs every aspect of life, but it's in a contemporary America, and so because ritual is an ordinary part of the world, it's set in a world where there are ritual bureaucracies and a government that is making of magic and ritual something boring and even oppressive. His ancestors came across the sea. Propelled by boredom, they set sail in boats covered with tar to prevent the stranded dead from eating the wood. They covered their bodies in nets to keep off the clouds of souls who flew at them like mosquitoes. They set sail, assuring each other that the Sea of Sorrows guarded the entrance to some lost paradise, a place where food of all cuisines fell into your mouth the moment you tilted back your head, where every few years you could clean, sparkle, and even reshape your body, like bringing your clothes to the laundry. Our heroine finds herself pregnant with someone who is foretold to be a new sort of feminist messiah, even, that is going to lead the world back to the truth of the power of ritual. But she's extremely unhappy about being pregnant, and the novel kind of begins from that opening. They made it over the sea and smashed their boats, for they thought they had found it, paradise. They were grinning and slapping each other on the back when suddenly they remembered to wash the paint from their eyes. At their first sight of the brown rock, many thought they must have left a residue of turpentine on their retinas. They scraped and scraped until the eyes fell out of their heads. Even now, if you pass the Sea of Sorrows to the bitter beach, you will see masses of eyes staring up at you, to be appeased only with photographs, and picture postcards of the lost world. He who runs away came out of his mother with his eyes open, all of them, even the ones behind the head, which most people leave safely closed until after death. He saw the world. He saw the cracked flatlands of his birth. He saw the hidden bridge back across the Sea of Sorrows. He saw the unspeakable green of the hill country, the grey teeth of the mountains, the holes covered by clouds. And having seen, he forgot.
And I should say this conversation is absolutely going to contain spoilers for the 1988 novel Unquenchable Fire. And as you say, so it's set in this sort of contemporary America, but an America that is almost a century after a revolution. And that revolution has this, you sort of mentioned ritual, but it's sort of connected to a kind of a theistic kind of ritual, right? This is gods or God. I mean, I think Rachel Pollack comes from a Jewish background and has been quite interested in Jewish sort of mythology in some of her other works, right?
That's right, but it's definitely a sort of pantheistic world in Unquenchable Fire, which is not entirely. It does fit with some aspects of Pollock's Jewishness as well. There are spirits in everything in this world, and certainly Jewish mysticism is one of the guiding things that shapes the world that she's created. And another huge part of the world that she's created is tarot. So some people who might not know Rachel Pollack as a novelist might know Rachel Pollack as an extremely influential writer on tarot, with numerous books over the years, and particularly her book 78 Degrees of Wisdom sometimes gets referred to as like a tarot Bible, because it was so influential in shaping how people thought about tarot in the kind of middle of the 20th century, the latter half of the 20th century. And Unquenchable Fire has many influences on tarot, and if you know tarot, then you start to see resonances kind of coming through the book, not least of which is that the book is structured in 22 chapters which correspond to the 22 cards of the major arcana. And when you know that, you start to see how tarot has become part of the story.
And just a little bit more situating before we sort of really jump into it. So this post sort of revolutionary society that's been built, there are figures called founders, who are the sort of original figures who had these visions and realized they were going to found this sort of new society. And in the sort of contemporary society in which it's set, there are tellers, and these are people who tell the stories of the founders and sort of propagate those stories. But as you said, it is also a very sort of mundane magic, which for example, electricity is powered by magic, but it is just the stuff running through your pipes. It is the stuff that just makes the kettle go, so it's got a really interesting sort of groundedness to it as well.
Yeah, exactly that. And that groundedness is something that makes the world appealing, but it's also a problem for this world, because the very ordinariness of magic means that most folk in this world are no longer connected to the kind of transcendental or mind-opening possibilities of ritual and magic, which were some of, let's say, the intentions of the founders. That there's the mundanity to it is a beauty and also a problem, I think, for the book. One sequence in the book that kind of drove that home for me is there's a repeated conflict between the heroine and the small urban community that she lives in. And all of her neighbors are gossiping about her and frowning on her for not going to various community rituals, and they keep trying to like recruit her into these events that the community is supposed to be doing to kind of continue as a connected group of people, and she keeps refusing and refusing and refusing until she's essentially cast out from that community. And that's kind of, it's this sort of extraordinary inversion of a common trope in fantasy fiction of somebody discovering magic and this leading them into greater connection with a world of magic users that they had always hoped for but never thought was possible. That's a really, and this is a real inverse of that. It's somebody who is living as part of a world where magic is extremely ordinary, and then starts to think of herself as being harmed by this world and resistant to this world, and trying to find another way to be for herself.
And there's more than one reversal of trope going on here, because as well as that refusal to engage with the sort of what the neighbors are getting on with, essentially keeping up with the Joneses is a phrase we have in the UK at least. The refusal of that, there's also the refusal of the whole call to action that the central character is sort of given against her will, because the central character becomes pregnant in a kind of immaculate conception kind of way, given a baby, and that baby is going to return everyone to the original sort of intent of the founders, right? Is going to bring everyone back into kind of conversation with nature and the sort of the truth of magic and all of that. But Jenny doesn't want that. She's not interested. She doesn't want to have a baby, and there's a challenging of that sort of a vessel for the immaculate conception trope there as well, right?
Yeah, there is. And I'm going to talk more about that. But before I do, the Catholic half of my family is not going to forgive me if I don't correct the misconception.
Please.
That the Immaculate Conception is not the Annunciation. It's not Mary becoming pregnant with Jesus. It's Mary's conception. That's the Immaculate one.
I have no religious background, but even as I was saying, it was going, this is not the right term, but I have confidence Josie knows it.
Don't worry, everybody uses it. And indeed, there's reviewers that talk about Unquenchable Fire talking about an Immaculate Conception.
Well, they should know better.
There we go. Anyway, but yeah, and I'm not going to go as far as to say kind of how that conflict is resolved in the book, although Unquenchable Fire it's a really looping narrative. It's happening in multiple timelines at once. It folds back on itself, and so you kind of see from very early in the book where things are going, and it becomes less attention of like what's going to happen and more attention of how are we going to get there, which I think is another interesting kind of form of storytelling. And it is, it's a book that is ostensibly about the birth of a Messiah that's going to lead the world back to a spiritual feminist revolution, which is kind of what the book's about. It's extremely resistant to its own premise, which I think is probably the most feminist way it could be written, in fact.
For sure. And I think a lot there about just how stories exist in our life, right? So there's the stories that all the neighbors are following, and that they've kind of got stuck in the rut of a story. And then there's the story that Jenny has been dropped into, which she's refusing. And just that grasping for agency, right? That grasping for wanting to decide the path of your story. I wonder if you feel like that's echoed through other themes in the book, or if I've got to it there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a book in an extremely rich and multi-layered way that is about the power of storytelling, or more concretely, it takes seriously the proposition that telling stories can change the world, and then asks what kind of world would actually, like, if we take that seriously, if the world is built on storytelling as a world-changing form of magic, what kind of world does that actually lead to? And when you referred earlier to the tellers in the book, who are a kind of shaman, a kind of movie star. They are huge celebrities that offer kind of authorized interpretations of the stories of the founders, and the way they tell stories continually reinscribes the way the world is built. But the protagonist of the book is looking for other ways to tell stories, and is troubled by the stories that she is receiving. And so it's not simply about, well, telling stories is powerful and that's good. It's actually about how lots of different types of storytelling, ways that storytelling becomes a power structure, how they all clash into each other and rub up against each other. It's also very trippy. Like, a lot of the book is confusing dream sequences and extraordinary fables, some of which are quite scatological. It's a very earthy book. It's a very bodily book. And there's a lot of ridiculousness and humor and strangeness in it as well. It's not an easy book, but it is one that is capacious and rewarding.
And I wonder, because another book I've been thinking about a lot recently is Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time, which 1976, I think. And I was thinking recently how very much that book feels like it kind of transcends the time in which it's written. I don't feel the 1970s in the book, although there's something in it about almost yearning to want to explode out of that era into a million different possibilities, right? But I wonder if you feel like this feels like a 1988 text, or if you feel like it's another one of these sort of, feminist future visions, which sort of gets away from its era entirely.
I think it's a bit of both. You know, the contemporary America that it's written in is an alternate 1980s. Like, it's not imagining necessarily a future America. It's one in which the kind of infrastructure of life is recognizable from the 1980s, and that's true in Women on the Edge of Time as well. You know, some of the narrative takes place in what was then contemporary, some of it takes place in the future, but the kind of future that it's imagining is rooted in, in imagining of the past. Another book that I love for that aspect is Nearly Roadkill by Kate Bornstein and it's two authors, and the one that isn't Kate Bornstein has escaped me right now, which is bad. I should look that up. It's called Nearly Roadkill, and it's a cyberpunk dystopia, but imagined from the internet of the 1990s. And so it imagines a future internet from the position of the 1990s, and it can't help but be extremely 90s. But all three of these books, even though there is a rootedness in the time that they're written, the ideas, just as you're saying, the ideas that they have are powerful enough and far-reaching enough and complicated enough that they escape from the period that they're written in. Yeah.
And I should say that we have the glorious attempt to do some Googling after the recording, because we'll be asking you for any notes that you want to put in the liner notes for the listeners. So you can find that other author, all will be well. So don't worry about that. Another aspect I just wondered if we could take a couple of minutes to sort of touch on is the fact that Rachel Pollack is a trans woman writing in the 1980s. And I feel like part of what brings the struggle at the heart of Jenny's experience to life is her urge for bodily autonomy, right? Like, I don't want to give birth to this child. And to me, as a cis woman, I believe that bodily autonomy for cis women is part of the same fight as bodily autonomy for trans folks, right? Like, I want the right to choose whether or not I bear a child. I want access to gender affirming care if I struggle with the menopause or one of many other things which can disrupt my sense of self, including my sense of gender. But it's a much more restricted for trans folks. And I wonder, as a trans woman yourself, if you feel like you can see things I don't in Pollack's writing, because I obviously am reading it from the cis perspective, and I wonder if there's anything you want to unpack for us in there.
Yeah,
not that you're speaking for all trans women.
It's a really interesting one with this book and Rachel Pollack's writing generally. Rachel Pollack was, in one sense, very, very out at the time as a trans woman. She was one of the founders, with Ros Kavanagh, another writer, of the trans wing of the London Gay Liberation Front. That was in the 1970s, late 1970s. She was a regular correspondent with an interviewee with various like trans community publications, and you'll find her in like a lot of trans feminist publications of the 1980s, 1990s. So in that sense, she was very out. But in another sense, it wasn't at the forefront of her fiction and wasn't explicitly addressed in her fiction until quite a lot later. And this is the 1980s, so you couldn't immediately go out and Google somebody, and people weren't, in a way that they often are now, for better or worse, picking up the book and knowing that it was written by a trans woman and thinking about the book through that frame. That wasn't a thing that was happening in the same way. Transness does not figure really explicitly in Unquenchable Fire. It does a little more in the sequel, Temporary Agency, which is much shorter and standalone and more accessible if people want a slightly more accessible introduction to this world and Rachel Pollack's work. There is a trans woman character in that who is extremely recognizable from anyone who knows the trans politics of the time. And then it becomes even more explicit in Rachel Pollack's later book, A Secret Woman, which was published in the early 2000s and is a murder mystery with a trans woman detective. It was also explicit a little bit more in Rachel Pollack's work in comics, where she wrote the first trans superhero in a major imprint, Kate Godwin, named after the aforementioned Kate Bornstein and also Chelsea Godwin. Kate Godwin, aka Coagula in Doom Patrol. So Rachel Pollack also authored. She has an extremely varied career. Rachel Pollack also authored a trans character into that major comics title, but it's not there in the same way in Unquenchable Fire, except it is, just as you say, partly in the themes of bodily autonomy, that the heroine is somebody who has been given a fate by the powers that be, the very literal powers that be, and is resisting that fate and resisting what power has destined for her body. So of course there's trans themes in that. There's also, I would say, some very sort of trans spiritual themes in this book, and that recur throughout Rachel Pollack's books, about there's a kind of orientation towards the spiritual self and towards ideas of transcendence, magic, spiritual exploration, that to me feel really trans in their orientation, in their longing for something more than the body, in their wrestling with what the body is, and in their kind of commitment to the power of remaking yourself through magic. And that's something that Rachel Pollack talks about more in interviews and in other pieces of work. There's a recent publication from PM Press, I think it is. I'll look that up and put it in the liner notes as well, that has a short story called The Beatrix Gates, that goes into this extreme, that's the name of the book, it's called The Beatrix Gates, and it goes into it extremely explicitly from a trans perspective. And you can then go back and like read the rest of Rachel Pollack's canon and think, yeah, so this was here all along. But also it speaks far beyond, as you say, it's not limited by its transness, it's expansive from its transness. So my first encounter with it was coming to Rachel Pollack's work two ways at once, when I was getting into tarot on the one hand and when I was getting into trans literature on the other. And then, like, within the space of a few weeks, I was like, oh, there's Rachel Pollack here and there's Rachel Pollack here. What's going on there? And getting very excited, to the point of extremely obsessed and a little bit evangelical about Rachel Pollack's work, hence this conversation. From the trans literature perspective, a lot of the history of our literature is buried and kind of forcibly forgotten from the literary canon. So even though Rachel Pollack has been really successful, critically, really influential on a number of other writers, including, very famous writers like Neil Gaiman, and they've had a mutual influence, I would say, in their work. She's not known to the mainstream reader. She won an Arthur C. Clarke Award. She won a World Fantasy Award. She was nominated for a Nebula Award and numerous others. But the average sci-fi or fantasy reader has probably not read her work either. And until recently, a lot of it was out of print. Some of it is now getting reissued by some sci-fi classics imprints. But, she was circulating in secondhand books. And that's the fate of a number of trans writers from that period. I think also of Jessica Amanda Salmonson, who was a very influential editor and anthologist and also wrote books. Hasn't written a new book for a long time. I think from her Facebook, I understand she's mostly looking after cats and a garden, which is a good fate for all of us. This happens to numerous trans writers, and so it took kind of reading back into the history of trans literature to find Rachel Pollack. So that's where I met her first. And then I was so struck by the strangeness of the book. And I knew on first reading it, there was no way I could understand every aspect of it the first time I read it. I first read it when I was just getting into tarot, and now I know the tarot much more intimately. I reread the book and I see it in different ways. I've now read a much broader world of trans literature and of feminist science fiction from the period, and I can see how it speaks to that. And I've also become more experienced as a writer myself. And so the themes of storytelling and the themes of the potential and power and also risks inherent within storytelling in a mass medium, storytelling in your own little strange little ways, like all the different ways that different forms of storytelling kind of speak to each other. Every time I come back to the book, I see a different thing in that. And it's because it's such a capacious book, because it has so many things in it. I have seen reviewers say it's overstuffed, and I think they're wrong. I only long for more stuffing, because it means that when you go back to it, you find something new each time.
Of course. And I think we should give you a moment to talk about tarot. I have to, you know this about me, the listeners may not. I am not someone who is particularly interested in tarot. I am, however, pretty interested in divination tools as storytelling tools, right? Like there are, people who've used the I Ching, who use many other cultural, traditional storytelling devices like tarot, and I appreciate that as a practice. Absolutely, I'm not like someone who's here to say, oh, I hate tarot just because I'm not interested in it, but it's not something that I'm deep into, so I can't ask you a very informed question, so I'm just going to give you a space to run free on tarot if you want to.
Yeah, I think what I would say, and I think Rachel Pollack might say something similar, is that tarot as a storytelling device is also its function for someone's personal practice. That what you're doing if you use tarot, whether it's in a divinatory way or in an introspective way, what you're doing is playing with this storehouse of symbols which have hundreds of years of interpretation and reinterpretation layered on top of them. And you're looking at whether it's one symbol that you draw each day, one card, or whether it's a spread of symbols, you're looking at this picture and this concatenation of stories and asking, what does this have to say about me today? What does this have to say about my life tomorrow? What does this have to say about the shape of my life over the course of my entire life, into the past and into the future? Whether you believe in it as divinatory or whether you're using it just as exploration, that the same thing is going on. And it's about, I think, surrendering yourself to the power of symbols and the power of stories, and admitting that stories and symbols have a power beyond your own ability and beyond your own understanding. We live and move through a world of stories. So maybe this little box of stories can help me navigate that world.
Mm. And I think there's a really lovely natural place to sort of move on to how living with Unquenchable Fire has shaped your practice and continues to shape your practice as a storyteller, or as one of the many, many things we've already described that you do?
Sure, I think there's a few things that it helps me remember, apart from just being fun. One is a really deep commitment to layered and thought through world building. That everything about the world of Unquenchable Fire is strange, and it's strangest almost the places that are closest to the world that we live in sometimes feel the strangest about it, because at every moment of writing about the world that the characters live in, Rachel Pollack has thought, well, how does living in a world of ritual shape this? How does it change it? How does it make it different? And it becomes layered through every aspect of the world. It's not a world with a sprinkling of magic dust on top. And it's not a world in which a few spells are thrown in a slightly incoherent way without thinking about the consequences for everything else in that world. It's thorough, and through its thoroughness, it becomes more delightful. I think that's a really important lesson. It reminds me a lot of Ursula Le Guin, actually, and Ursula Le Guin's guidance on world building, and how Ursula Le Guin thinks about technology in science fiction, that technology is everything that people in the world use, whether that is a pencil or a fishing net or an ion engine or an Ansible. What the technology that you use shapes your entire world. And for Unquenchable Fire, that technology, because I would call it a science fiction novel as much or more than a fantasy novel, that technology is ritual, and it's thoroughly worked through. So there's that. And then the other piece of inspiration that I take from it is a willingness to be extremely weird and to follow that weirdness wherever it leads, and to be uncompromising is one word for it. But I think prefer generous. I think it's generous. I think it is generous to the reader to pursue the weirdness of your vision as far as it can possibly go, because the farther you go with it, the greater a gift of possibility that you're making to the reader. I don't want to patronize my readers with the familiar. I want to honor them with the strangest thing I could give them.
And I really, really enjoyed working with you on the thing I hope we will announce really soon from Die Gute Fabrik, because I have a strong drive to, not towards naturalism, but towards building strong foundations for weirdness. But you've always been there saying, let's remember to keep the weirdness, though, right? Like I'm here asking for sort of naturalistic dialogue, or like, let's think through how this thing is actually situated in the world. And you're there going, but remember, let's keep it weird. And that's like a really wonderful thing to bring to sort of collaborative making as well, I think.
Yeah. And I also think those two things are complementary. That I think as an Unquenchable Fire, like the weirdness of the world is founded in naturalistic dialogue, ordinary human relations, treating everybody in it as a thinking, feeling, breathing being, and not treating any of the magic as superfluous, but as integral to these people's way of being in the world. So they're I would say they're almost the same thing, but from different perspectives.
Mm. And we're sort of getting closer to sort of wrapping up now, but I wondered if sort of penultimately, if you would like to sort of offer out to the listeners, if there was a lesson or a thought or something you'd like to offer particularly about Unquenchable Fire to everyone.
I think that the first time you encounter it, the best thing to do is to surrender yourself to it and let it do its work to you. I don't think anyone will understand it all on first reading, and it might necessarily be a bit frustrating, a bit confusing, a bit annoying at times. And I think those are actually good qualities in a book, and there should be enough of it in it as a book to carry you through. And if that's a piece of specific advice about Unquenchable Fire, I think there is then a lesson there about encountering all art which is to feel a certain relaxedness in the encounter, and to not, those of us brought up in a normative school system are made to feel a lot of shame and fear if we don't understand what's going on. And I speak as a poet who is constantly having to have conversations with people about how school ruined poetry for them and how they just didn't understand what was going on. And all I can say to them is, like, fair enough. Like, the way that poetry is taught is, you dissect it, you pick it apart with tedious instruments, and there's nothing in there about joy, ecstasy, music, surrender, following what pleases you, which are all the things that for me are central to poetry. So there's something in the book that pleases you. Follow it and let the things that confuse and frustrate you pass by until you encounter them in a different way, and then maybe they'll have something to say, or maybe they won't. I think that's true of all art.
I was wondering if you have anything that you would like to promote, and particularly I would love for you to explain to the listeners a little bit more about Deep Wheel Orcadia, because it's not easily contained in a sentence, I think.
Sure. What I'm not sure when this is coming out, so I don't know what particular things I will have to promote. So maybe I should just talk about the book, because it's been out for a year or so, but it's still traveling, which is an extraordinary thing for me. So Deep Wheel Orcadia is a verse novel set in a very distant and future space station that is almost but not entirely unlike contemporary Orkney, or perhaps, as my parents pointed out to me, having read it, a bit more like the Orkney of the 1990s, which is the Orkney I grew up in, with reference to the earlier conversation. And it is written in the Orkney language, the Orkney dialect of Scots, with an accompanying English translation. Although the translation is playing some games with the idea of translation that I think is doing something to destabilize how we think about the relationships between language. And the book is a love story between two characters, Astrid and Darling, one of whom grew up in the space station, which is called Orcadia, and is returning, and the other of whom is visiting Orcadia for the first time. And it's about the relations of power and language and emotion between those two, and what that means to each of them. And it's also a story about a community facing a profound social, ecological, and technological crisis, which is also true of the Orkney that I live in now. That's what it's about. It's quite it's a small book. You can read it reasonably quickly, but it's one that I hope carries enough in it to support rereading. We've also made it into, as I did with the previous book, into a live performance with a full score from a string quartet. So I perform the book to an original string quartet score, which is honestly the most glamorous thing I've ever done. And I believe everyone should be accompanied by an original string quartet score at all times. Look out for future touring of that show if you're listening to this podcast and are interested in literature, performance, poetry on the stage, poetry and music. We are always interested in opportunities to perform that work,
and internationally as well. You're not just talking about. Yeah,
and I've toured spoken word performance internationally before, and we can do that, and we'd love it. Speaking of international, if there are minority languages worldwide that would be interested in a translation, or the dominant languages, although we'd have to have a conversation about that, we're also looking for people who are interested in translation rights to the book.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of One Cool Thing from Die Gute Fabrik. As usual, leave that rating or review where you can. If this time was of value to you, then that's the best way to say thanks. I'll be back soon with a new episode speaking with another cool thinker and maker in the field of video games. And in the meantime, check out Die Gute Fabrik on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Where you can find us, we're there as Gute Fabrik, which is GUTEFABRIK. This podcast was produced, edited and sound designed by Tom Wally. Additional production and research by Unamin Kavanagh. Our theme music is by Nick Ellis, whose music you can find under the name Tenby on Bandcamp. That's TENBY. Stay thoughtful, friends. Take care. Goodbye.